Today we look at session 2 in a series of lectures on leadership and motivation. In the first session we introduced a backdrop or a framework for looking at leadership that also introduced the notion of motivation. In that context of leadership that we're looking at, we divided or distinguished leadership between two roles or styles. One has to do with holding position or maintaining status quo or staying the course. The other being more aspirational in nature, and that is one of taking the mountain, of moving somewhere, moving a group somewhere that we haven't been before. Now, just as a review, the whole position role or style is called transactional leadership, and involves inducing behavior using environmental factors or factors extrinsic to the individual. We call those factors structural. In the style or role to take the mountain, that is called transformational leadership, and that's related to inspiring the behavior of the followers. And I'll keep it on. That involves it's called transformational leadership, and that involves inspiring the behavior of the followers. And this is the notion of leadership where we appeal to the intrinsic factors of the individual. As leaders, we penetrate the hearts and minds of our followers, affecting the factors that are internal to them that actually drive their behavior. And this style we would label interpersonal. Now, let's stay here. The structural focus of leadership has often been labeled a stimulus response form of leadership. And this is based on the assumption that people are primarily social beasts, or these people respond to their environment. They're stimulated by their environment, and their behavior is more of a reaction to environmental stimulus than it is intentional aspirational behavior. The interpersonal role or style of leadership is based on the assumption that people are aspirational, that they're rational beasts, that they think their way through life, that they look to the future, they have goals, they have targets, they have wants, they have needs, and their behavior is driven by those goals, desires, wants, and needs. Okay, you can come back to the face. Let's review a couple of points from the original session, the first session. The focus of the first session was, after introducing the guiding principles of leadership and the framework of leadership we're going to discuss in this lecture series, we looked at the movie Rudy. The idea was to learn some concepts about motivation that would be used more in the interpersonal role or style of leadership, one in which the leader is penetrating the hearts and minds of the follower. And in that context, we deal with the notion of motivation more than we do in the structural model. We will look at both today, but let's review the motivational lessons that we learned from the movie Rudy. This cartoon helps us illustrate the major points that we wanted to make in the movie Rudy. First of all, we see that the dad comes in and asks children who wants to ride over to the bank. Well, there's no behavioral response. When the bakery is mentioned, the car's loaded and on its way. Well, what do we learn from this? First of all, motivation must be related to a specific targeted behavior. We could not claim that the children were more or less motivated as a general characteristic of the children. We could only deal with the notion of motivation once we looked at a targeted behavior associated with the motivation. And secondly, we see that motivation is primarily based on valence. In other words, what we want. The children did not respond to going to the bank because the bank is not what they wanted to do. But going to the bakery stimulated an aspiration in the children that led to their behavioral reaction. Also, we'd like to review the model of behavior that helps us understand where motivation fits. Motivation is a psychological process whose output is the effort directed toward a specific behavior. Effort is defined as the direction and intensity of a person's attentional resources, and this effort, which is the outcome of motivation is influenced both by characteristics of the individual and characteristics of the situation in which the individual resides. Okay, come back. Okay, back to our guiding principles of motivation. We see that we have structural roles of leaders, those roles in which leaders manipulate or construct around individuals factors that would lead to responding to behaviors that the leader desires. And that's in contrast to the interpersonal role or style of leadership in which the individual, which the leader penetrates the hearts and minds of the individual and affects its motivation. Now we will look at both roles and styles based on the literature around behavior and motivation. While motivation is generally addressed around the interpersonal style of leadership, some would say that motivation is involved in the structural forms, but there are at least some behavioral models that are helpful for us to understand if we're looking at structural models of motivation too. Under the stimulus response view of behavior, or what we would see as mostly associated with structural leadership, there are several concepts we want to look at today. One is control systems. The other is reinforcement theory or reinforcement models. Thirdly, social exchange theory. And lastly, leader-member exchange. Under the aspirational role of leaders, we want to look at what we call the EIV model, the efficacy, instrumentality, valence model. Now within this model, we will look at a series of motivational theories and concepts. We'll look at self-efficacy, we'll look at goal setting, equity theories, job enrichment, empowerment, and need satisfactions. Recognizing that these are not totally contained within these. Yeah, come back to me. Let's go back to me. Recognizing that these theories and models are not absolutely contained in these two roles of leadership, they're helpful for us and they're directionally correct in explaining and informing how leaders can affect behaviors of their followers in these two different roles. The first models and theories that we want to look at under the structural are control systems. Control systems can be either formal or informal. Formal control systems usually take the form of policies. Informal systems take the form of culture. Policies is simply the establishment of rules, procedures, guidelines that individuals must follow in order to participate in the organization process that they belong. One thing that we know about rule following is that it's a limiting or constraining force or factor on employees' behavior. Culture, on the other hand, is an informal control system that establishes what is important and what behavior is expected of employees. In other words, culture are the values and norms of the organization. And this guides and directs employees' behavior in some significant ways. Next, we want to look at reinforcement theory. Now, reinforcement theory is based on Thorndike's law of effect, which is 100 years old now, but has been around and studied and still is seen as applicable in terms of human behavior. The law of effect simply says behavior with favorable consequences tends to repeat, while behavior with unfavorable consequences tends to disappear. Now, this was followed up a few years later by what's called reinforcement theory.